Well, good morning. Hey, I want to say a special good morning to those of you in the room. Also, good morning to those of you who are in Saginaw and Monroe, and then those of you who are joining us online. You know, we're in week 3 of Together Again. And if you're new around here, you may be asking the question, what is Together Again? If you came on week 1, you saw that we had this big, huge block party, and so you might have thought to yourself, Together Again is an event where we gather and we do community types of things, or you might be thinking Together Again is a teaching series. You know, I think that you might have come today because somebody invited you, but you also might have come to church because your interest was piqued when you saw this video of me and one of our other teaching pastors, Grant Agler, online. Watch this.
We've been isolated and apart from each other, but now it's time to be together again.
What's that?
I don't know.
Yeah. How's it going, man?
We've all missed being together, but distance and time away has only made us realize how important gathering really is.
No complaints.
That's good. It's good.
Yeah,
Cool.
for sure. Yeah.
Nice day. Nice day.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, let's see.
But we might be a little out of practice.
I mean,
Yeah.
You gotta go. Yeah,
Kind of.
yeah. I mean,
But
it's good to see you.
Good to see you too. You know, when people have seen that video, people have been blowing up my phone, and they typically ask me 2 questions. The first question people always ask me when they see that video is, why? Why? Why do you have 2 middle-aged guys running towards each other? And here's the second question people always ask me is, what's wrong with Grant in that video? What's wrong with him? And my answer to that is, we don't know. We've been trying to figure that out for years. But all joking aside, here's what Together Again is all about. It's if I was to define it, I could define it in 1 of 3 ways. I could say, number 1, it's our fall initiative. We believe as a church that we should gather. You know, we talked about this in the weeks previous, but the word church that Jesus is going to use in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, is when he looks at Peter, he says, Peter's going to say, you are the Christ. And then what Jesus is going to say, he's going to say, upon this rock, the revelation that I am the Christ, I'm going to build my church. And the word that he uses for church in Greek is the word ekklesia. It's a compound of 2 Greek words. You have ek, which is the word out. You have kleo, which means I call. So it's a called out assembly for a mission. So we believe that this is our fall focus, to gather together. But I think the simplest way that I can explain what our mission and our focus as Together Again is all about, it's kind of like a family reunion. You know, in normal times, whatever normal times are, we have this moment on the calendar where 364 days will go by where we haven't seen friends and family. But there's that one day where we regather and we connect. And there's something inside of us that feels this excitement when we see people that we haven't seen in a year. And little Terrence, who used to be this tall, is now this tall. And then Katie or Kanisha are now graduated from college and they are engaged. And Uncle Bob is retired, and there's something inside of us that says, I like this. And the same is true for us as the church. You know, for the last 16, 18 months, there's a lot of us who've gotten out of the habit of going to church. There's a lot of us who have been maybe afraid to go to church. And if you have a health restriction, we understand that. But this is like a family reunion. And doesn't it feel good when reunions happen? I can prove it to you. For those of you who are a little bit younger, there was a moment where you felt heartbreak. It was when the Jonas Brothers split up, but I want you to think about how you felt when this happened. When they reunited, there's something inside you that said, man, this is good. Or, for those of you who are a little bit older, when this happened, when New Kids on the Block got back together. Anybody remember New Kids on the Block? Step by step. Don't make me sing it here. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you cry when One Direction broke up, there's still hope for a reunion. But here's my bigger point. See, there's something inside of us as humans that long for reconnections because we are wired that way. It's in the fabric of our society as an American group of people. but it was also that way for the Jewish people. I want you to look at this. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 16, starting in verse 16. God is going to say to his people, 3 times a year, all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. At the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. So right there on the plains of Moab, right before God's people go into the promised land, Moses is going to give them the law a second time. That's what the word Deuteronomy means, second law. And when he gathers them together in the plains of Moab, he says, listen, a lot's going to happen in the years to come. But on your calendar, there should be these 3 family reunions. Number 1 is the festival of unleavened bread. A lot of Jews would consider that to be Passover because the festival of unleavened bread was a 7-week or a 7-day festival, and Passover was a 1-day festival, so they would celebrate that together. Then 50 days after that, they had a festival called the Festival of Weeks or Pentecost. But then in the fall, they had a festival called the Festival of Tabernacles. And what tabernacles were is they would camp in these little tents and they would remember what it was like to be in Egypt. And I got to tell you, I would have been great with the first 2, the Festival of Weeks and the Festival of Unleavened Bread, but camping in a tent, to me, that's like what purgatory is. I just can't do the camping in a tent. But they would celebrate these 3 times, and God goes on to say this in the end of verse 16, going into verse 17. It says, no one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way that the Lord has blessed you. So 3 times a year, they would reunite, and when they would reunite, they would remember who they are and where they've been. And when they reunited, they would come together and they'd go, wow, I haven't seen you in a year. I haven't seen, how's your family? How's your kids? And they would connect, and there would be this sense of joy because they are reconnecting. See, that principle in the Old Testament, we see it practiced in the New Testament in John chapter 2 and John chapter 3. If you got a Bible or a Bible app, I want to invite you to get there. Because in John chapter 2 and John chapter 3, we see Jesus at one of those festivals. He's at the first of the 3. He's at the festival of the Passover, and he's there, and people are intrigued by Jesus. He's the talk of the town, for better or for worse. Because Jesus is the kind of guy who stirs up controversy everywhere he goes because of the miracles that he does. I mean, Jesus' miracles are so extraordinary that he doesn't even have to be in the same place to perform a miracle. There's one particular time where a guy has a servant who's sick, and Jesus just sends his word and that man gets healed. There's another time at this particular Passover that we're going to talk about where Jesus is going to heal the man who's been sick for 38 years. Jesus was miraculous, but he was also deep and insightful. The way he taught scripture, the way he communicated it, people were amazed at his teaching. Well, that's where we are in John chapter 3, or into John chapter 2, going into chapter 3. Here's what it says. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. Here's what made Jesus interesting and so hard to understand. On one hand, he had popularity, but he never allowed himself to become a celebrity. Because everywhere he went, people were like, wow, that's interesting, that's amazing. And people kept trying to follow him, and they kept trying to understand who he was. But I want you to notice, it didn't say that Jesus didn't trust people, he didn't entrust himself to them. Because Jesus lived with a purpose. And when you have the purpose of God in your life, when you know why God's created you, why he's put you here, then you begin to live with a sense of confidence and a sense of focus, and you don't need other people to validate who you are. Thank you. And so what you have here is Jesus living in that reality, and then here's what happens in John chapter 3. It says, now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night. Now his name is Nicodemus. He came to Jesus at night. I call him Nick at night. He comes to Jesus. Here's what he says in verse 2. He says, Rabbi, We know that you are a teacher who has come from God, and no one can perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. Can you see what's going on in Nicodemus's mind? I don't quite get you, but what I cannot do is invalidate you. Because we ain't never seen miracles like this. We never seen a guy who's been sick for 38 years and you just speak to him, take up your mat and walk, and all of a sudden he's walking and he's running, and we just ain't never seen anything like this. Here's how Jesus is going to respond. So he gives Jesus a compliment, and Jesus is then going to answer the question he's really asking. Verse 3. Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." Oh, I just came to pay you a compliment. But this is what I love about Jesus. He sees what's going on in the heart. So then the man is going to ask this question, verse 4. "How can someone be born when they're old?" Nicodemus asked. "Surely they cannot enter a second time in their mother's womb and be born." Nicodemus is like confused. He's like, "Hey, Jesus, I saw The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. I thought that was a work of fiction. I didn't think that was a documentary. What are you talking about?" And Jesus doesn't back down. I imagine if Nicodemus is kind of saying, yeah, okay, if you're saying to be born again, if all I got to do is, if to get into heaven, I got to look like Brad Pitt, sign me up for that, I'm in for it. But here's what Jesus is going to do. Instead of backing down, he doubles down. In verse 5, Jesus is going to say this, "Verily, truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born of water and of spirit." Verse 6, "Flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying that you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit." Jesus says, listen, Nicodemus. See, in verse 1, what we learn about Nicodemus is that Nicodemus is not your average Joe. He's a member of the Jewish ruling council. He's a Pharisee. He knows the law backwards and forward. Not only does he know the law backwards and forward, Nicodemus has power and authority, and Nicodemus is so intrigued with Jesus, he's going to come to him at night. Now, we don't know why he comes to him at night. Maybe he comes to him at night because he's scared that somebody who's in power will see him talking to this kind of rebel rabbi. Maybe he comes to him at night because he's trying to understand, what does Jesus have that he's missing? You know, that's why I think a lot of people come to church. It's because there's a lot of people who have a lot going on. Some of you have influence. Some of you have affluence. Some of you have popularity. Some of you have money. Some of you have success, but you feel like there's something missing. You've achieved the American dream, but there's still something missing, and that's what's going on with Nicodemus. And Jesus said, "I know what you're missing. It's not more laws. It's not more principles. You got the laws of Moses, 613 laws. What you need is not laws. You need the life of God living on the inside of you." And so what's going to happen for him is Jesus is going to say, everybody who's born of the Spirit, they exist in these two dimensions, kind of like the wind. You can not see the wind, but you can see its effects. What Jesus is saying is somebody who's experienced the life of God, they're hard to quite understand. Because on one hand, they look just like you and I. You can see the effects that God's Spirit is working in their life. Like you have somebody like, we'll just call him Mark. And Mark has had an anger problem all of his life. But then he meets Jesus. And now Mark has peace in his life, and even though he has the same problems, he still has peace. Or we'll just call somebody like Margaret. All her life, she's struggled with low self-esteem. But when she meets Jesus, all of a sudden she's taking risks. All of a sudden she's going after it. She's living for a bigger purpose, and you can't quite understand, what is it about Margaret? It's not that she got a makeover, she got Jesus. And so what Jesus is saying, he says, this is the difference maker in your life. You need to experience this life change. And then Jesus is going to say this, or in verse 9, Nicodemus is going to ask this question. He's going to say, how can this be? How can this be? I imagine some people who are listening to me right now, that's the question you're asking. Like my life right now, it feels like a hot mess. I've made so many decisions that have broken my heart, that have broken the hearts of others. And every time I do a reset, every new year I say, this year is going to be different. Every time I try to make changes and adjustments, and it feels like I just keep messing it up. If I could experience a second chance, if I could get a fresh start, a new beginning, I want that. How can this be? Here's how Jesus is going to answer that question. Verse 10, Jesus is going to say, you are Israel's teacher, Jesus said, and you do not understand these things? For very truly I tell you, we speak of what we know and testify of what we've seen, but you people do not accept our testimony. I have spoken to you of earthly things, but you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who has come down from heaven, the Son of Man. This last statement that Jesus makes is worth the risk. Nicodemus had to put a lot on the line to go visit Jesus. The whole time I imagine his heart's beating fast because he's a member of the Jewish ruling council, and he's kind of wondering, what are people going to say if they see me talking to this rebel rabbi? I don't know if I'm going to lose school points. But he interacts with Jesus, and Jesus says, listen, you're trying to figure out what you've never experienced or what you've never seen, but I'm the one who can show you how to get there because I'm from there. In this moment, Jesus is going to reveal that he's the Messiah. And what I imagine for Nicodemus is he goes, The whole time we as Jewish, faithful Jewish people, we've been praying and we've been crying out and we've been believing to see the Messiah and hoping that we'll see him. And here he is. There's a reason why your miracles cannot be understood. There's a reason why every time you talk, I don't know if I understand or agree with it, but I'm drawn to know more. And then we get into verse 14. Drop down to verse 14. Jesus is going to move from being confusing to being extremely clear as he lays out what he's talking about. In verse 14, it says, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, and everyone who believes may have eternal life. Now we get to verse 16. This is the verse that some of you have a tattoo of. This is the verse that you see in the end zone when you're watching Michigan's best college football team, Michigan State. This is that verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but would have eternal life. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. He knows his Old Testament. What Jesus is going to do, he's going to take him back to Numbers chapter 21. In Numbers chapter 21, we have a story. In this story, we have the children of Israel who are going to sin. And when they sin, when they flagrantly disobey God, they start getting bit by these snakes. What Moses is going to do is he's going to take a bronze snake and he's going to lift it up. And everybody who's been bitten by the snake because of their sin, all they have to do to experience life is look at the snake. Which, as I was thinking about that this morning as I was on my drive over here, I had this thought, most of us don't really understand sin. Because oftentimes when we think about sin, we see it as something that we do, whereas the scriptures always look at sin as a sickness that starts to rot us from within. And the more that we engage in sin, the more it makes us sick emotionally and spiritually. It ruins our relationships, it ruins our family, it ruins our mental health, it ruins every part of us. But here's the struggle. It's the same question that Nicodemus is asking, how can this be? How can I get out of this situation that I'm in that I can't fix myself? I've been to counseling, I've been to self-help. I don't know how to get better. And what Jesus is saying is the first thing you have to do is you have to look at the very thing that you've been participating in. The snake, the serpent. All throughout Scripture, it's a symbol of evil. So you remember Adam and Eve there in the garden, everything is good, everything's perfect, everything's fine. And then comes the serpent into the garden and says, it's not as good as it seems. Really? Yeah, no, it's not as good as it seems. And they follow the serpent, and the serpent leads them to sin. In Numbers chapter 21, you have the same thing. These people are now in sin, they're in immorality, and it feels good in the moment, but then it bites them. This is what sin always does to us. It bites us. But the answer is to just look up, to believe. This is why there was a guy who lived in the 4th century by the name of Augustine. This is why he said this. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. And the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. I'll say it one more time. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. It's pointing to this reality of something to come. And then the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. We understand why that story is in there is because Jesus said, it is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen for me. I'm going to be lifted up in the wilderness. And the Son of God, who has never sinned, is going to be made and covered in our sin. When we look up and we see the reality of what he suffered for us, what we're going to see is the love of God. You know, there's a lot of people who are looking for a lot of things in life. Some people are looking for more Twitter followers. Some people are looking for more Instagram clicks. But at the core, what I think we're all looking for is for love. And we will never be truly satisfied until we find a love that's bigger than this world can offer. And that's why many of us are not satisfied right now. I meet a lot of people and they will tell me, you know, Pastor, I'm just looking for love. And I can't find it. And I'm frustrated because I believe in it and I want it, I go after it. But the greatest love is the love that Jesus displayed on the cross. That the Son of God, who never knew sin, was covered in sin. And when we look and we believe, we experience life. All of a sudden, Nicodemus feels, man, it finally makes sense. I spent my whole life performing and trying to be better. I spent my whole life trying to live up to what causes me to feel sad and guilty. You know, I think there are a lot of you who are here today, and you don't wear it on your face, but you carry it in your soul, and it's guilt. Because you try really hard. And you're constantly trying. You're constantly doing everything you can to perform to be better. But what Jesus says to this really smart guy is, look and live. Look at the reality of what I came to do for you on the cross. Believe. Then it brings the question, what does it mean to believe? What does it mean to believe? Is believing just mentally connecting and saying something's true? Or does it mean something more? In the New Testament, to believe means to put your weight on it. It's for me to put all 150, well, no, I'm lined up in here in church. It's for me to put none of your business on this seat and trust. That's believing. And it's in that moment that Nicodemus has a light bulb moment. He goes home thinking, wow, I don't have to try so hard. I can experience some kind of life change. And the way people express that belief around here at 242 is in baptism. In baptism, what we say is that it is a symbolic representation of a spiritual reality. So when I put my faith in Jesus, what I say, it's a private decision that I make that, Jesus, I love you. But publicly, in baptism, symbolically, I bury that old life under the water. I say, I'm done. How does it happen? How do you experience change? How do you go from who you used to be to who God's called you to be? Is in baptism, I bury that old life. As I bring this message to a close, let me just give you 3 things that happen when you get baptized. Here's the first thing that happens when you get baptized is in Romans chapter 6, it talks about this, is you proclaim something. It's a public proclamation. It's kind of like when I got married. I got this ring that I wear on my finger, and many of you have heard my proposal story, so I won't tell you again. The proposal was a private decision. But publicly, me and my wife, we stood before our pastor. Our pastor happened to be Pastor Paul, and we made vows. He said, for better or for worse. He said, Keith, are you going to be there for her on her good days and her bad days? And that was the moment I said, how many bad days you plan on having? Because depends. But then when he asked me this question, he said, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I said, I do. I was proclaiming a decision that I made in private to the world. When we get baptized, we're proclaiming, I'm changed, I'm different. But here's the second thing that typically happens, is not only do we proclaim something, we receive something. When we get baptized, we receive like a new sense of hope and confidence. Here's what happened when Jesus got baptized. Bring up Matthew chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. It says, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment, the heavens was open. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. I want you to leave that up for a minute. I want you to notice this before Jesus did any miracles. This is before Jesus was the talk of the town. When he gets baptized, he receives the approval, the favor, the blessing of God. Now, we have other pastors who do a lot of baptisms around here. I don't do a lot of baptisms, but most time when I meet somebody in the back before they're getting baptized, I pray that they would have this experience. That when they come up out of the water, they would just sense the approval of God. And for most people, what happens is this pressure to perform is lifted. Because all of our lives, here's what we're told. If you perform better, you'll be liked better. So that's what we live our lives doing, trying to perform in business, trying to perform in life and society, trying to perform, trying to show off who we are on our social media profile, on our dating profile. But when we meet Jesus, when we say, Jesus, I'm surrendering my life to you. In baptism, I'm making that decision. I'm expressing my faith. What happens is we just experience God's pleasure. You know, last night we had a baptism. I'm gonna show you a picture of this family who got baptized. You can bring up a couple pictures. This lady here had been going to church for years. And as she started to get deeper into the Bible, she said, you know, I was baptized as a baby, but now I understand what that means. That it's about walking with Jesus, expressing my faith in all that he is. And so today I'm gonna go public. And then I think we got another picture of her and do you have the picture of her daughter getting baptized? Isn't that amazing? Can we just celebrate that? But let me bring this to a close with this. Here's the last thing that happens in baptism. It's most time we experience something. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says this. Now, I'm going to quote it out of the older translation because when I was a youth pastor, I named my youth group 220. Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. But the life that I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul said, I used to be a bad dude. Like, there's stuff when I think about my past, I don't even want to remember it. But thank God for Jesus. Because that old me was crucified. I left the old me in the water. I die. But then he says, I live. But I don't have to do this by myself. I can do this through the power of God's Spirit, and I change. I change through God's power, and I'm committed to changing the world. You know, there are some of you who are here today, and what I'm talking to you about right now, it's a revelation. You're thinking, I don't need better performance. I don't need another self-help book. I don't need another sermon. What I need is I need to trust God, to believe and be baptized. But for others of you, this is a reminder. And the reminder is you don't have to live life alone. The power of God is inside you. He's changing you. He's making you new. You have a purpose to live out. And that purpose is really the reason to live. Let me just say this last thing. You know, the first week of the series, I was at the Lansing campus. And while I was at the Lansing campus, here's what I said. The pandemic has been destructive in so many different ways, and it's disrupted our lives in so many different ways. But I think what the pandemic has brought to all of us is an understanding that life is short. And there's two ways you can live life. You can live to just survive, or you can live for significance. You can live to say, I don't know how long I have, but I'm going to take every minute that I have, and I'm going to live it to make a difference in this world. I think when we totally say, God, I'm going to follow you, that's what happens. And while you're thinking about that, I want you to see a story of a lady who that happened for named Emily. Watch this.
I grew up in a Christian home, and I grew up going to church, really involved in youth group. I had all of these really great mentors and people and church people in my life, but I just started down a not so good path, and my priorities really shifted. I began experimenting at first just with like drugs and alcohol, and then eventually really became kind of overcome by that. I really tried to keep the facade and the outside image that like everything was cool. I was like, you know, still had it together, but when I got to college, I really embraced that identity as like a party girl and really struggled for a number of years with that. For me, there was a lot of like hatred almost. Like I knew what I was doing wasn't what God made me to do, but I couldn't stop doing what I was doing, and I hated that about myself. And it got really dark, honestly. One specific day, I just woke up and knew that I wanted something different and that I wanted to change. So I called my mom and told her kind of what had been going on with me. And then I sought treatment and kind of got immersed in a 12-step recovery program. There was a lot of work to be done in like overcoming and learning how to live a life that was like healthy and sober and all of those things. But I feel like God just came in and took away the struggle. And that was just huge, freeing, like this weight lifted off of me. I chose to do it on Easter just because the story of Easter has always just been so powerful to me. Your old self is crucified with Christ, and then you're raised again in new life, and I just thought that was really like powerful, and that's what I desired out of the whole experience, was to just like let that old life go. I really think I still, again, like 4 years, removed from my old life, I think I still carried that guilt and shame. And so the experience of just being baptized and just being buried and risen was just like so incredibly powerful. I would say the number one thing about me was that like I was an alcoholic or I was an addict. And coming to 242 in the community around here, those things were true about me, but I felt like my primary identity started to be just that I was a child of God, and they just loved me for the sole fact that like I was a child of God. God has just blessed my life in so many ways, and this community has blessed my life in so many ways, and now I know that I'm never alone because God is with me.